The morning of June 7th, 1945, dawned clear and warm over the farmlands of central Nebraska. Heinrich Weber stood in the back of a canvas-covered truck, his hands gripping the wooden slats as the vehicle bounced along a dirt road flanked by endless fields of young corn. He was 23 years old, a former corporal in the Wehrmacht's 4th Panzer Division, and until 3 weeks ago, he had never seen an ear of corn growing in soil that wasn't scorched by war. The truck carried 16 German prisoners of war, all dressed in the same dark blue denim work uniforms with the letters PW stenciled in white paint across their backs. They were being transported from Camp Atlanta, a prisoner of war compound outside of Holdrege, to a farm owned by a man named Ernest Patterson. Weber had been told very little about what awaited them, only that they would be working in the fields and that the work would be hard. He expected nothing less. What he did not expect, what none of them expected, was what they would be paid. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The previous evening, A.U.S. Army lieutenant had addressed the prisoners in halting German, explaining the conditions of their labor assignment. They would work 8 hours per day, 6 days per week. They would receive the same wages as civilian farm workers, 80 cents per hour, paid in scrip that could be exchanged for goods at the camp canteen. Weber had stared at the lieutenant, certain he had misunderstood. 80 cents per hour, the same rate paid to free American workers. It was impossible. In the world Heinrich Weber knew, in the ideology that had shaped every moment of his adult life, prisoners were slaves. They existed to serve the Reich until they could serve no more. The concept of paying an enemy soldier a fair wage for his labor violated everything he had been taught about the natural order of power, about the superiority of the strong over the weak, about what victors owed to the vanquished, which was nothing. Yet here he was, riding through the heartland of the nation that had defeated him, about to discover whether the lieutenant's words represented some elaborate deception, or whether the Americans truly operated under principles so foreign to his understanding that they might as well have been describing life on another planet. The truck slowed, turned onto a smaller road, and Heinrich Weber leaned forward to catch his first glimpse of the farm, where his beliefs about the world would begin their slow, irreversible collapse. To understand Heinrich Weber's shock, one must first understand the world that forged him. He was born in 1922 in the small Bavarian town of Landshut, the son of a postal clerk and a schoolteacher. His childhood unfolded against the backdrop of Germany's humiliation after the First World War, the crushing weight of reparations, payments, and the economic catastrophe that left millions unemployed and desperate. By the time Heinrich entered secondary school in 1933, the Nazi Party had seized power, and with it came a complete restructuring of how young Germans understood their place in the world. The Hitler Youth became mandatory in 1936, and Heinrich, like millions of others, was absorbed into an organization designed to produce soldiers and believers. The doctrine was simple and absolute. Germans were members of a master race, destined to dominate inferior peoples. Slavs, Jews, communists, and other designated enemies were Untermensch, subhuman, fit only for enslavement or extermination. Strength was the only virtue that mattered. Compassion toward enemies was weakness. Fair treatment of the defeated was a sign of racial decay. This ideology was reinforced in every classroom, every rally, every film and radio broadcast. Heinrich learned that the Treaty of Versailles had been a criminal conspiracy designed to crush Germany's rightful dominance. He learned that Germany's defeat in 1918 had resulted not from military failure, but from betrayal by internal enemies. He learned that the new war, when it came, would be different because Germany would be led by men who understood the true nature of power. When Heinrich was conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1941, this worldview became operational doctrine. During his training, officers explained how conquered populations in the East would be used as forced labor to support the German war machine. The conditions for these workers were deliberately brutal. Soviet prisoners of war died by the hundreds of thousands from starvation, exposure, and overwork. This was not considered a failure of the system, but rather its intended function. Inferior peoples existed to serve German interests. Their suffering was irrelevant. Heinrich absorbed these lessons and carried them through 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front. He saw how captured Soviet soldiers were treated, how civilian populations in occupied territories were exploited for labor. When his tank was destroyed near Kursk in July of 1943, and he spent 6 months recovering from burns, he witnessed the vast apparatus of slave labor that kept German industry functioning. Jewish prisoners, Soviet POWs, and forced laborers from across occupied Europe worked in conditions designed to extract maximum productivity before death. This was the normal order of things. This was how wars were won and empires sustained. When Heinrich's unit was surrounded and captured by American forces near the Ruhr Pocket in April of 1945, he expected to experience this same system from the other side. The treatment Heinrich Weber would receive as a prisoner of war in the United States had been determined not by battlefield commanders, but by international law and American political calculation. The foundation was the Geneva Convention of 1929, which established rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States had ratified this treaty, and despite the fact that the Soviet Union had not, American policymakers decided early in the war that the U.S. would adhere to Geneva Convention standards for all prisoners. This decision was partly ideological and partly practical. President Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors believed that maintaining high standards for POW treatment served multiple purposes. It encouraged German and Italian soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. It provided moral high ground in contrast to Nazi atrocities. And it protected American prisoners held by Germany, since reciprocal treatment was more likely if the U.S. demonstrated compliance with international law. The Geneva Convention specified that prisoner of war labor could be used by the detaining power, but with crucial restrictions. Prisoners could not be forced to work in war industries or on tasks directly related to military operations. They must receive the same safety protections as civilian workers. And critically, Article 23 stated that prisoners employed on labor must be paid a fair wage for their work. American implementation of these rules went beyond minimum compliance. The War Department established that German POWs working in agriculture, forestry, or other non-military industries would receive 80 cents per hour, the prevailing wage for similar civilian labor in 1945. This wage was paid in scrip, usable at camp canteens where prisoners could purchase tobacco, toiletries, extra food, and other goods. The canteens were stocked with items that many prisoners had not seen in years: American cigarettes, chocolate bars, razor blades, writing paper. The decision to pay market wages was controversial among some Americans, who argued that enemy soldiers deserved nothing beyond minimal sustenance. But military planners recognized that well-compensated prisoners were more productive, less likely to attempt escape, and more willing to cooperate. The policy was also defended on moral grounds. The United States was fighting a war to preserve civilization against barbarism, and civilized nations honored their treaty obligations. By June of 1945, approximately 378,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. Roughly half were engaged in labor, primarily in agriculture, where severe labor shortages threatened crop production. These prisoners picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in Minnesota, cut timber in Oregon, and worked on farms throughout the Great Plains. They lived in camps that, while Spartan, provided adequate food, medical care, and shelter. And they were paid wages that seemed incomprehensible to men raised under Nazi ideology. Heinrich Weber knew none of this history, as the truck carrying him and 15 other prisoners turned onto Ernest Patterson's farm. He knew only what his training and experience had taught him: that prisoners existed to be exploited, that victors owed the vanquished nothing, and that any kindness shown to defeated enemies was weakness. He was about to discover how deeply wrong those lessons had been. Ernest Patterson's farm covered 420 acres of rolling Nebraska prairie, planted primarily in corn and wheat, with smaller sections devoted to alfalfa and vegetable gardens. Patterson was 58 years old, a third-generation farmer who had lost both his sons to the war. James had died at Anzio in January of 1944. Robert had been killed during the Normandy invasion 5 months later. Patterson's wife had died of pneumonia the following winter, leaving him alone to work land that had sustained his family for 3 generations. He needed labour desperately. The 1945 growing season had arrived, with Patterson facing the prospect of crops rotting in fields he could not harvest alone. When the county agricultural agent informed him that German POW labour was available through the War Department's program, Patterson had hesitated. The thought of enemy soldiers working land his sons had died defending created a moral knot he struggled to untangle, but necessity outweighed sentiment, and he had signed the necessary papers. When the truck arrived that June morning, Patterson watched from his porch as 16 men in denim work uniforms climbed down and formed a loose line in his yard. 2 American guards accompanied them, both armed with rifles, but carrying themselves with an almost casual alertness. The senior guard, a sergeant named William Morrison, approached Patterson with a clipboard. "Mr. Patterson, these men are assigned to you for the duration of the harvest season," Morrison said. "They'll work 8 hours per day, 6 days a week. You're responsible for directing their labour and providing drinking water during work hours. Meals are provided at the camp. You'll submit weekly reports on hours worked, and the Army will handle all wage payments directly." Patterson nodded, studying the faces of the men before him. They were young, most appearing to be in their early 20s. Several showed signs of old injuries. A man with a badly scarred hand, another whose left ear was partially missing, a third who stood with the slight forward lean of someone whose back had been damaged. These were not the supermen of Nazi propaganda. They were exhausted soldiers who had lost a war. Heinrich Weber stood in the second row, watching the American farmer with careful attention. Patterson was tall and lean, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. He wore overalls and a faded blue work shirt, clothes that showed honest wear. When he spoke to the sergeant, his voice was level and businesslike, betraying no particular hostility but also no warmth. "All right," Patterson said finally, addressing the prisoners directly in slow, clear English. "We're going to start with the North 40. Corn needs cultivating. I'll show you what needs doing, and then I expect you to work steady. You do the job right, we'll get along fine." One of the prisoners, a former schoolteacher named Klaus Becker who spoke functional English, translated Patterson's words into German. The men nodded their understanding. They had expected harsh treatment, perhaps violent overseers, certainly the kind of brutal exploitation they had witnessed in German labour camps. Instead, they received straightforward work instructions, delivered in the tone a foreman might use with hired hands. The work itself was hard, but not deliberately punishing. Patterson distributed hoes and demonstrated the technique for removing weeds from between corn rows without damaging the young plants. The June sun climbed toward its zenith, and the temperature rose into the mid-80s. Every 2 hours, Patterson brought water in a large metal canister, filling tin cups that the prisoners passed among themselves. At noon, Morrison called a halt for lunch. The prisoners sat in the shade of Patterson's barn, eating sandwiches and apples that had been prepared at the camp. Heinrich Weber bit into an apple and felt something close to wonder. It was fresh, crisp, and sweet. He had not tasted fruit this good since before the war. The first payment came at the end of the first week. Heinrich Weber and the other prisoners were assembled in the camp's administrative building, where a U.S. Army finance officer sat behind a desk with neat stacks of scrip certificates. Each prisoner's name was called, and each received an envelope containing payment for the hours worked. 48 hours at 80 cents per hour, totaling $38.40. Heinrich stared at the scrip in his hands. $38. In the German prisoner of war camps he had known, Soviet prisoners received nothing. The entire economy of the Reich's war production had been built on millions of unpaid workers labouring under the threat of death. And here he stood, a defeated enemy soldier, holding wages equivalent to what an American citizen would earn for the same work. The camp canteen opened immediately after the payment distribution. Heinrich followed the other prisoners inside and stopped just past the threshold, overwhelmed by what he saw. The shelves were stocked with goods that had become luxuries or impossibilities in wartime Germany. Camel cigarettes, Hershey's chocolate bars, Colgate toothpaste, Gillette razor blades, Wrigley's chewing gum, writing paper, envelopes, pencils. There were also practical items like work gloves, socks, handkerchiefs, and small toiletries. The prices were listed clearly. A pack of cigarettes cost 15 cents, a chocolate bar cost 5 cents, razor blades were 10 cents for a pack of 5. Heinrich did the mathematics in his head. With his week's wages, he could purchase 253 chocolate bars or over 200 packs of cigarettes. The abundance was staggering. He purchased cigarettes, chocolate, writing paper, and envelopes, spending $3 and leaving himself with over $35 in remaining scrip. As he walked back to his barracks, carrying these goods that represented more personal wealth than he had possessed in years, Heinrich felt the first tremors of cognitive dissonance that would eventually fracture his entire worldview. That evening, he sat on his bunk and wrote a letter to his mother in Landshut, if she still lived and if the letter would reach her through the chaos of occupied Germany. He struggled with how to describe his situation. How could he explain that he was being paid a fair wage for honest work? That his captors treated him not as a slave, but as a laborer with basic rights? That the Americans seemed genuinely committed to following rules that protected even their enemies? Klaus Becker, the schoolteacher, occupied the bunk next to Heinrich's. That night, as the barracks settled into quiet, Klaus spoke into the darkness. "I taught children that Americans were weak," he said, "that their democracy made them soft, that their concern for individual rights would be their downfall." He paused. "I was wrong about everything." Heinrich said nothing, but he lay awake long into the night, turning Klaus's words over in his mind. He thought about the propaganda films he had watched, the radio broadcasts he had heard, the lessons he had absorbed. All of it had insisted that strength came from hierarchy, from the ruthless domination of the weak by the strong. The Americans were supposedly corrupted by their egalitarian principles, weakened by their adherence to laws that treated even enemies with basic dignity. But the evidence before him contradicted everything. The Americans had won the war. Their industrial capacity had buried Germany under an avalanche of tanks, planes, and artillery. Their armies had crushed the Wehrmacht across 2 continents, and now, in victory, they were paying their prisoners fair wages and stocking canteens with luxuries while Germany starved in ruins. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Perhaps strength did not come from brutality. Perhaps a nation's power grew not from the exploitation of the weak, but from principles that even victors honored. It was a thought so dangerous to everything Heinrich had been taught that he could barely allow himself to think it fully, but it persisted, growing stronger with each day of fair treatment. The turning point came 6 weeks into Heinrich Weber's assignment to the Patterson farm. It was late July, and the corn had grown tall enough that working the rows meant moving through green corridors that blocked most of the wind. The heat was oppressive, and Patterson had increased the frequency of water breaks to prevent heat exhaustion among his workers. During one such break, Patterson sat down in the shade next to Heinrich and Klaus Becker. For several minutes, the three men drank water in silence, watching heat shimmer above the distant fields. Then Patterson spoke, and Klaus translated. "You men work hard," Patterson said. "I appreciate that. You do good work." Heinrich nodded, acknowledgement. Patterson continued. "I had 2 sons. Both died in this war. James in Italy, Robert in France." He paused, and Heinrich saw grief settle across the farmer's weathered face. "I thought I would hate you. When they told me German prisoners would work my fields, I thought I would hate every one of you." Klaus translated, and Heinrich felt his chest tighten. This was the moment he had been expecting since his capture, the moment when American civility would crack and reveal the hatred that surely lurked beneath. But Patterson's next words were not what Heinrich expected. "I don't hate you," Patterson said quietly. "You're just young men who fought for your country, same as my boys fought for theirs. The war's over. Hating you won't bring James and Robert back." Heinrich stared at this man who had every reason to despise him, whose sons had died fighting Heinrich's army, and who had chosen something other than hatred. Klaus translated, his voice unsteady. Patterson stood, preparing to return to work. "You'll get your full wages, same as any man who works my land. You've earned them." He walked away, leaving Heinrich and Klaus sitting in the shade of the corn. Heinrich found his voice. "Ask him why," he said to Klaus. "Ask him why they pay us. Why they treat us like this." Klaus called out to Patterson, who stopped and turned back. Klaus posed the question in English, and Patterson considered it for a long moment before answering. "Because that's what the law says, the Geneva Convention. We follow the law, even for prisoners, even for enemies. That's what separates us from the Nazis." He paused. "My boys died fighting for a country that follows its own laws. If we stopped doing that, their deaths would mean nothing." Klaus translated, and Heinrich felt something fundamental shift inside him. Patterson was not being kind out of personal generosity. He was following a system of laws that existed independent of personal feelings, laws that protected even those who had no power to demand protection. This was not weakness. This was a kind of strength Heinrich had never encountered. That evening, back at the camp, Heinrich wrote another letter to his mother. This time, he did not struggle to find words. He wrote about Patterson, about the wages, about a system of law that valued human dignity even for defeated enemies. He wrote about the lie he had been taught, the fundamental deception at the heart of Nazi ideology, that strength came from domination rather than from principle. He ended the letter with a sentence that would have resulted in his execution had he written it 2 years earlier. "We were told that our enemies were weak because they valued law over power. We were wrong. Their strength comes from their laws, and that is why we lost." The transformation that began in Heinrich Weber spread through the prisoner barracks like a slow-moving wave. Men who had been raised on Nazi propaganda, who had fought for years believing in the superiority of German strength and the weakness of democratic principles, found themselves confronting evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. By August of 1945, the war in the Pacific had ended with Japan's surrender, and the full scope of Nazi atrocities was becoming undeniable even to German prisoners. The camps received newspapers and magazines, and many prisoners saw for the first time the photographs from liberated concentration camps. The piled bodies at Bergen-Belsen, the crematoria at Auschwitz, the skeletal survivors of Dachau. These images arrived simultaneously with their continued experience of fair treatment under American custody, creating a psychological crisis that many struggled to process. Heinrich watched as some of his fellow prisoners retreated into denial, insisting the photographs were Allied propaganda. But others, including Klaus Becker and a growing number of younger prisoners, began the painful work of reconciling what they had believed with what they now knew to be true. The discussion groups that formed in the barracks after work hours became, in effect, exercises in collective deprogramming. "We were told that treating prisoners humanely was weakness," Klaus said during one such discussion in late August. "But the Americans won the war. Their system proved stronger than ours. We need to understand why." The answer emerged gradually through observation and conversation. The prisoners noted that American guards, while maintaining discipline, followed clear rules of conduct. Officers who violated regulations faced consequences. The camp operated according to written procedures that applied equally to everyone. This was not the arbitrary exercise of power they had known in the Wehrmacht, where officers' whims carried the force of law. This was something different. Power constrained by principle. The economic dimension reinforced this lesson. By September, Heinrich had accumulated over $200 in scrip savings. He purchased goods not just for himself, but to send packages to his mother through the Red Cross system. Other prisoners did the same, using their wages to support families in devastated Germany. The irony was not lost on them. They were earning American money to help rebuild the country they had fought to destroy. Ernest Patterson continued employing the prisoner labor through the harvest season. Heinrich and 5 other prisoners worked his fields through September and into early October, bringing in corn and wheat that would feed American families through the coming winter. Patterson paid them promptly every Friday, never shortchanging their hours, never treating them as anything other than workers entitled to fair compensation. On the last day of the harvest, Patterson gathered the prisoners who had worked his farm for 4 months. Through Klaus's translation, he thanked them for their labor and told them they had done good work. Then he did something that Heinrich would remember for the rest of his life. He shook each prisoner's hand. Heinrich felt Patterson's calloused palm against his own, felt the firm grip of a man acknowledging another man's honest labor, and understood that he was experiencing something that Nazi ideology had insisted was impossible. An enemy showing respect, a victor extending dignity to the defeated, strength expressing itself through restraint rather than domination. As the truck carried them back to camp that evening, Heinrich looked out at the Nebraska farmland rolling past, at the neat fields and distant farmhouses, at the physical evidence of a society that had organized itself around principles other than raw power. Germany lay in ruins, its cities destroyed, its people starving, its ideology exposed as a murderous lie. And here, in the heartland of the nation that had defeated them, German prisoners earned fair wages and were treated according to law. The question that haunted Heinrich was not why the Americans had won. That was obvious. The question was how Germany had ever convinced itself it could win while building everything on foundations of brutality and exploitation. Heinrich Weber remained in American custody until June of 1946. The process of repatriating hundreds of thousands of German prisoners was slow and complicated by the chaos of occupied Germany. During those additional months, Heinrich continued working on various farms in Nebraska and Kansas, accumulating wages that he saved with careful discipline. The re-education program administered by American authorities accelerated during this period. Prisoners attended mandatory classes covering German history, the crimes of the Nazi regime, and the principles of democratic government. Many prisoners resented these classes as victors' propaganda, but Heinrich found himself absorbing the lessons with growing recognition. The democratic principles being taught were not abstract theories. He had lived them. He had experienced a system where laws protected even the powerless, where fair compensation was not an optional kindness but a legal requirement, where human dignity was treated as a right rather than a privilege granted to the favored. In April of 1946, Heinrich received a letter from his mother. It had taken 6 months to reach him through the damaged German postal system. She was alive, living in the ruins of Landshut, surviving on rations provided by American occupation authorities. The city had been bombed repeatedly in the war's final months. The house where Heinrich had grown up no longer existed. Her letter described conditions that Heinrich could barely comprehend. Entire city blocks reduced to rubble, thousands homeless, food scarce enough that people fought over scraps. Yet she also described something unexpected. The American occupation forces, she wrote, were distributing food to the civilian population. Children received milk and bread, The sick received medical care. It was not generous, she noted, but it was more than she had expected from conquerors. Heinrich read this letter, sitting in the camp barracks, surrounded by men who had similar news from home. Germany had not merely lost a war. It had lost everything: its cities, its economy, its moral standing, its future. And the nation that had defeated it was now feeding its children. He thought about the propaganda he had been taught. Americans were supposed to be weak, corrupted by Jewish influence, incapable of the ruthless strength required for survival in a harsh world. But the Americans had crushed Germany militarily, and now they were preventing mass starvation among their former enemies. They were strong enough to destroy and principled enough to rebuild. When Heinrich finally boarded a ship for Europe in June of 1946, he carried with him nearly $400 in savings, converted to occupation currency. This money, earned through honest labor while he was a prisoner of war, represented more wealth than most German civilians possessed in the devastated economy. He also carried something less tangible but more valuable, a fundamental reorganization of his understanding of how human societies could function. The ship docked in Bremerhaven, and Heinrich stepped onto German soil for the first time in over a year. The port city was a landscape of destruction: bombed buildings, cratered streets, hungry people moving through ruins. American military police directed the returning prisoners toward processing centers. Heinrich watched these American soldiers, remembering how he had been taught they would treat defeated Germans. With cruelty, with exploitation, with the same brutality Germany had shown its conquered peoples. Instead, he saw order, he saw systems, he saw laws being followed even in a conquered nation. The processing center provided medical examinations, delousing stations, and basic rations. It was not comfortable, but it was organized according to procedures designed to prevent the spread of disease and maintain minimum standards of human dignity. Heinrich traveled by train to Bavaria, watching the devastated German countryside pass by the windows. Every city showed bomb damage, every town had been touched by war. But he also saw American supply trucks distributing food, military engineers rebuilding bridges, and occupation forces maintaining order. The Americans were acting according to plans, following policies, implementing a reconstruction program that treated even defeated enemies as human beings, deserving of minimum standards of care. When he finally reached Landshut and found his mother living in a basement that had survived the bombing, Heinrich embraced her and wept. Then he gave her $200 in occupation currency, keeping $200 for himself to start rebuilding a life. She stared at the money, incomprehending. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "The Americans paid me," Heinrich said. "They paid me fair wages for honest work, just like they said they would." The program that employed German prisoners of war on American farms was one of the largest and least known aspects of the home front during World War II. Between 1943 and 1946, approximately 425,000 German POWs were held in camps across the United States. Roughly half of these men participated in labor programs, working primarily in agriculture but also in forestry, food processing, and other non-military industries. The total wages paid to these prisoners exceeded $57 million, a substantial sum in 1940s currency. This money flowed into camp canteens, where prisoners purchased American goods and was eventually repatriated to Germany in various forms, providing hard currency to a devastated economy. The program was economically beneficial to the United States, filling critical labor shortages while reducing the cost of maintaining prisoner camps. But its significance extended far beyond economics. For men like Heinrich Weber, the experience of fair treatment under law represented a form of political education more powerful than any classroom instruction. They had been raised in a system that taught them strength came from domination, that showing mercy to enemies was weakness, that laws were tools of power rather than constraints upon it. And then they experienced a different system, one where even prisoners of war had legally protected rights, where fair compensation was not optional, where human dignity was treated as something inherent rather than earned. Historians have documented that German POWs held in the United States showed significantly lower rates of commitment to Nazi ideology after repatriation compared to prisoners held in Soviet camps or even British facilities. The American insistence on following Geneva Convention rules, on paying fair wages, on maintaining standards of treatment that recognized prisoners' humanity, created what some scholars have called re-education through experience. Men learned democratic principles, not through propaganda, but through living in a system that actually operated according to those fellas principles. Ernest Patterson continued farming his Nebraska land until his death in 1963. He never remarried, never had other children to replace the sons he lost. But he employed returning veterans when they needed work, hired immigrant laborers when immigration increased in the 1950s, and paid everyone the same fair wages he had paid German prisoners during the war. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he had been known as a fair man, which would have pleased him. Heinrich Weber returned to Landshut and used his American wages to open a small shop selling household goods. He married in 1948, had 3 children, and lived to see Germany transform from ruins into a prosperous democracy. He rarely spoke about his time as a prisoner of war, but when he did, he focused on one memory: an American farmer who had lost both sons in the war, shaking his hand and thanking him for honest work. The central irony of the German POW labor program was that it demonstrated the strength of principles the Nazis had dismissed as weakness. The United States could have treated prisoners with brutality. It could have used them as slave labor, working them to death as Germany had done with millions of captives. The choice to follow international law, to pay fair wages, to maintain standards of human dignity even for defeated enemies, was not forced upon America by necessity. It was a choice rooted in principle, and that choice proved more powerful than brutality. The system built on exploitation and domination collapsed into ruins. The system built on law and human rights emerged victorious and helped rebuild what the war had destroyed. Heinrich Weber stood in a Nebraska cornfield in the summer of 1945, a defeated soldier holding wages in his hand, and learned that everything he had been taught about strength and weakness was backwards. The real strength had never been in Germany's armies or its brutal ideology. The real strength was in a farmer who followed the law even when grief tempted him toward hatred, in a nation that honored its principles even when dealing with enemies, in a system that recognized human dignity as something no defeat could erase. That lesson, learned by hundreds of thousands of German prisoners across American farms and forests and work sites, helped shape the post-war world. Some truths can only be taught through experience. Some lies can only be exposed by living their opposite. The morning Heinrich Weber climbed onto that truck in June of 1945, he believed he understood how the world worked. By the time he left American custody a year later, he knew he had been wrong about almost everything. The cost of that truth was the collapse of every certainty he had built his life upon. But the value of that truth was a future built on something better than the ruins of a lie. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.